Deputy Daly.
There's an awful lot of ideas there, yeah.
Thank you very much indeed, and thank you to our guests for their responses. Our next member to ask some questions, Senator Niall Donnghaile.
Yeah, thank you, gentlemen, for the presentation. The difficulty about following Claire is she's asked all the good questions already. So I was going to touch on the issue of Brexit and also new communities. But to be fair, Brexit is one we all feel compelled to ask because of the uncertainty of it. But we equally understand that it's very difficult for you to answer given the circumstances. So maybe to perhaps frame it in a different way, as opposed to, the unfair nature of trying to plan for a Brexit that we don't know the detail or content of. Are there still additional plans, strategic plans for the cross-border policing and the nature of it that exists already, and also to build upon it? So is there a 2, 5, 10-year plan, for example, around some of that other existing work, and also how that work can be built upon that's ploughing on regardless of what happens in terms of the fallout of Brexit? I wanted briefly to just ask ACC Todd around the significance in terms of a PSNI experience of community policing around engagement, Alan, with firstly restorative justice projects on the ground locally and what impact they make, and also, I suppose, the localised accountability structures outside of PCSPs and statutory bodies, for example. So, because I think you probably acknowledge a lot of the positive examples that you pointed to of good practice, a lot of the time they're actually initiated by communities as opposed to either the PSNI or the statutory bodies. So the significance of that, Chair, and then I've one or two additional questions.
That's fine. Thank you, Senator. Assistant Chief Constable, would you like to take that, please?
So, starting with the Brexit element, I think I've been in a range of meetings in Belfast, Dublin and other places, and it's difficult to plan for what you don't really know what it is. And actually, even getting central government to define the parameters of working assumptions has not been straightforward because of the negotiation position, because of a changing situation. So, I mean, that's understandable, but it doesn't make it any easier for people like myself and my colleagues to come up with a plan around it. So, I think it would be fair to summarise what we're doing to date is looking at the range of work that we currently do and have done over recent times on a cross-border basis, and looking which of those pieces rely on European instruments or European legislation or regulations, and trying to work out if we lost those, how we would then maintain what we currently have. So, the European arrest warrant allows us to bring people north to south, south to north for offences. It's pretty well practiced, pretty well routine. If we didn't have it, what would that look like? Information sharing, which is the lifeblood of passing information on both north-south but UK-wide and Europe-wide operations. That information sharing across a range of disciplines is the lifeblood to a lot of policing operations. Which parts of that and which access to those systems requires European regulation? And if we didn't have it, what would we need? And then taking all of those and saying to our Department of Justice and other partners, those are where the gaps are going to be. Those are what we need to fill, and that forms the basis for that plan going forward. Those things that we do have control over, the meetings, the face-to-face exchanges, the secondments, north and south, south and north, building of relationships, maintaining relationships, cross-border joint task force on organised crime, all of those things continue as structures, and we continue to look behind the scenes at what bits of that might fall off in a Brexit scenario, and how would we make sure it doesn't, or how do we put something else in its place to make sure we don't lose what is, because it, I know a previous Chief Constable got into some political hot water by saying at the end of the day the border is just a line on a map. I know what he meant, it's not the way it was heard, but it's, it does have challenges for law enforcement and other agencies, and we have learned how to work with that, and having got to that space we need not to lose it. So that I think is how I would sum up the work on Brexit to date. I think the longer 2, 5, 10 piece really has to come when you know what you're dealing with, and have a much stronger sense of what's available to us, what we might want in addition to that, and how we take that forward. So I think that's a piece of work.
So, how damaging would the appearance of any kind of infrastructure or mechanics along the border be to that existing and that positive work that has taken place, as you said, over the last 10, 15 years? Is there concern and preparation for that? I know we have heard continuously that no one wants to see that, but it could be a potential outcome, and how much would that undermine certainly your own experience of cross-border community policing, whether it's dealing with communities or it's dealing with the issues of rural crime, and how that has a very unique impact, I suppose, along the border, given the nature of it?
We're in an unfortunate situation in Northern Ireland still. We have what are described by others as the continued existence of micro-organisations who seek to use violence against police officers and indeed the wider public. We would clearly, as a police service, be nervous about anything that would become a focus and that those people could use as a focus to try and harness discontent and use that as some sort of quasi legitimacy for their actions. So that would clearly be that's clearly a concern for policing, and the Chief Constable has said that as much on numerous occasions in public fora. So we do have concerns around that. In terms of the conversation here today and the impact on local community policing, I think we would be, inherently or out of our policing and community ethos would just make us uncomfortable at the notion that local community teams would be looking to enforce or be part of a border structure that didn't have the agreement, approval or acquiescence of local communities, and where that, how you position local policing in that, how you position policing in it generally alongside other agencies in whatever a border might look like. From a local policing and community legitimacy piece makes us nervous.
Yeah, I think that's the more pertinent issue there in relation to your own experience. Just to ask, Chair, as well, ACC Todd, you had mentioned, I just want to see if this figure was correct, in response to Deputy Daly around the armed response. Did you say over 50% of the situations that they're being directed towards are turning out to be issues of maybe dealing with people with poor mental health, or basically, I think you were alluding to it, that we're dealing with instances that weren't set up to deal with? Was it over 50%?
Yeah, and that's not an exaggeration. That's not just one day it was particularly bad. That's a recurrent theme. Most of those interventions will be people who are threatening self-harm, threatening suicide, threatening to harm family members through mental health, drugs, or substance abuse of some mix. Just to be clear, that's not what they were set up to do originally, but they do now and are highly trained around that. It's a more comprehensive response for us to do it that way as an organisation, because they have much more training, access to much more equipment, much more less than lethal options to deploy in those situations. Which, if they weren't available, would lead to inevitable increase in tragic outcomes for those.
And I would presume the vast bulk of those interventions would be requested by police at a community level. I mean, I assume this is happening at socio-economically depraved or so-called communities, disadvantaged areas where that request would be coming from. Well, and I know there's a bigger philosophical question there that Claire and myself would probably allude to, but I'm just trying to get a better understanding in terms of, certainly the more positive, interventive nature of that in supporting people and ultimately keeping people safe, but also then, I suppose, in terms of follow-up and process, how that individual is then dealt with, whether it's, it may well be a case that someone is presenting a danger, but there also may be the circumstances where, is there any kind of, I'm not trying to sound green either, because obviously there's a policing aspect to it, but in terms of follow-up around wraparound services, if that person has identified as being, vulnerable or in a poor state of mental health.
So sort of try and take your queries in order there. Undoubtedly, the demand levels are higher in the urban centres, but I think that's as much a product of numbers as it is deprivation. Okay. Because frankly, if you look at suicide rates and suicide numbers, it knows no barriers to any door, any home, or any class or any creed, and we see broadly the same spectrum. Certainly, the numbers in the urban centres drive the demand for my armed response units, but what we see across the country. And that's one of the challenges in providing a service of that specialism at speed across a wide area, is a challenge for us. I don't think it's just as clear-cut around deprivation. Though clearly, you know,
Okay.
all your other health indicators will push you in that direction, and I'm sure there are trends in that direction as well. So it's certainly part of it.
Fair enough.
But it's not a stranger to anybody's door, frankly. And we see that demand across the piece. You then asked me about
Follow-up.
the follow-up. Well, yes. It's not as good as it should be, and that's just my perspective. Others would argue differently, and it's an anecdote, but it outlines our frustration. We got criticism from an ombudsman report not that long ago now on a missing person who tragically took their own lives and jumping into the river in Belfast. And we had some shortcomings around that. We've accepted the report, we've accepted the recommendations, but behind that, there's a little bit of us uncomfortable. That was the third interaction we'd had with the individual over a 3-day period. And on the first 2 occasions, we had taken the individual off the street and taken them to the hospital for medical care. And they were released, and we came across them again. We took them back to hospital, and they got medical care, and they were released. And then they tragically took their own lives. Our follow-up on the back of that wasn't good. But you talk to an operational officer, goes, if this system worked better, this wouldn't happen. And it's not a frustration that we're getting the criticism. It's a frustration that despite our best efforts and best interventions and taking that person to a qualified place of care, that they ultimately end up taking their own lives. That's the frustration, not that we got criticism about it, because that's, you know, that's comes our way when we don't get it right.
In terms of that ombudsman report, has there been any recommendations subsequently implemented as a result of it?
Of course, and you know, and that's, I suppose, is, you know, is the nature of things. Reports take time to come out. We don't wait. If there are obvious lessons, we learn them and we put them in place. But you know, huge numbers of missing persons a year. Some of that, you know, put the links between there and children and care. And you've got massive amount of work, massive amount of risk. You've got child sex exploitation just thrown into the mix, and that's the complexity of policing. And you know, I talked about this in my introduction. You know, an investigation used to be that the police officer went, saw the person, took some notes in a notebook, talked to a few other people, and wrote a report. You know, now you're seizing CCTV and examining mobile devices, and you know, and that incident, the time to do a proper investigation around it, 6 times longer than it used to be. It needs a lot more skill than it used to, and a lot more technology. So that's just the nature of the complexity of the business, and missing persons and everything else has just, with the volume, has added to that. You know, also from my contact management sort of hat on, which, you know, for me is still a big piece. It is the shop window of local policing. Most people lift the phone when they want to talk to police, and that what service they get there, what services are available to them through contact management centres and indeed online offering is an increasing area of business which helps us balance some of the stresses that we've talked about earlier. But you know, you can definitely see the changing nature after 4 o'clock on a Friday when all the other agencies aren't working. And therefore your question to wraparound is, not only is there not a handover wraparound, but at the weekends, you know, we talk about the police being the emergency service of last resort, even when it's not our core business, and that continues, and made worse under resource constraints for partners.
And that's for a comment, and just to finish up on it. Yes.
What's already been raised, if I may, and if I could, just to put Assistant Chief Constable Todd on notice, just Senator O'Donnell did reference restorative justice.
Yeah, sure. I knew there was something else. Sorry, yes.
Could you pause and think about that for a moment while I take the Assistant Commissioner, and I'm just giving you a heads up that that's coming.
Thank you, Chair, and I'll be brief. I suppose, look, it is important to look at the entirety of what the police do around this, and what Alan describes is common probably to all police services, you know, including ourselves. But international research, and it is applicable to us as well, clearly indicates that the police spend about between 10 and 20% of their time acting in extremis, and 80% of it dealing with non-police issues, which is one of the core arguments for a community orientation, that 80% of your time, actually, you're not dealing with these issues. So you should be dealing to try and engineer them out of the system, or provide some sort of an intervention as a police service, you know, that is different to what we're doing today, waiting for things to happen. So, look, it's really important that we know what we're talking about here in terms of the volume of what Alan is describing, and what we do for the rest of our time, you know, because it is going to underpin the argument or discourse around community policing and how we should actually change around this. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Assistant Commissioner. Would the Assistant Chief Constable like to come back in on the restorative justice? Are we okay on that?
And the community safety kind of networks there that are existing.
Please.
So, I mean, it's been a journey with community-based restorative justice, and I think I think policing had mixed views on it at the start. I think some of that was because there was a perception, rightly or wrongly, fairly or unfairly, that some former combatants were becoming involved in low-level community policing. I think that was dealt with by accreditation, training, and frankly confidence building around the process. The policing view on it is, it seems to work. It seems to have high degrees of community acceptance, and it would be, if you talk about policing in the community and you have something that works and that the community gets engaged with and approves of and accepts, it would be, it's almost churlish for policing to go by that. It's an opportunity to, I think, in the spectrum of responses to combating crime, I think it's an important element. And again, if we were to continue the way we're doing with partnership hubs and service providers of that, and what I would say commissioned services coming out of local hubs with a partnership management structure around it, I think it would sit in there very neatly in terms of, what's happening here, where our reducing and offender partnership structures between ourselves, probation, youth justice and others, has community restorative justice as a part of that spectrum, and how we bring a downward pressure on prolific offender rates. So I think it has travelled the journey, and I think it fits that model where, there are parts of the Fresh Start Agreement in Northern Ireland around community co-design of solutions for community problems, and I think it sits very much in that space.
I don't know, Assistant Commissioner Leahy, if it's much utilised in this state.
It is an element of policing here, but has been used, I suppose, mostly in the area of young offenders. Okay. So like every jail in the country would be used to engaging in restorative practice meetings with people, and it is very effective, but it is very much labour intensive and time sensitive, I suppose. And
who delivers that in the south? Is it localised community organisations, or is it done facilitated by the
well, the guards themselves deliver it, but there are other organisations there. I mean, when we were caught up in the North Inner City with the feud, we were providing assistance in upskilling local communities in restorative practice approaches, with others now, I might add. But I mean, we have people that are really well skilled in that area, and it has potential. We attempted to use it with on a community-wide scale, but it has significant challenges, particularly in the situation that we found ourselves in the North Inner City. It was very much alive, very much connected. Everybody was living, in close proximity. So it wasn't as effective as it could have been, but it was applied by others to some of the younger members of the community, and we assisted in relation to that. So very, very positive. Certainly something that needs to be expanded in policing and in Garda Síochána for sure, but the outcome, generally speaking, across the world has been positive around restorative practice.
Okay. Chair, I may just finish just by asking, I don't think we'll be able to do it for this report, but I think just given the level of detail and some of the enthusiasm around the table, there may be merit in engaging our visitors down the line and maybe seeing some of these models at work. And also, particularly, I think it would be very beneficial if we got a notion of the nature of community policing along the border, and also the virtual non-existence of a border as is, and how that impacts and works across the board. So that's maybe just something to put to you, Chair, later in the year, or when available.
All right, Senator, we'll go. Thank you.
Maybe our colleagues can facilitate that. Maybe they'd be up for it. We'll need them.
We'll come back to you all. Thank you, Garda.